I've never liked late-night trains. There's something about the silence, the empty seats, and the dim lights that gives me chills. But that night, I didn't have a choice. I had to catch the last train home after staying late at work. The station was almost empty when I got there. Just a few people scattered around, all looking tired or lost in their thoughts. The train pulled in with a screech, and I boarded, relieved to finally be on my way. As I walked down the aisle, I noticed how quiet it was, too quiet. I could hear the soft hum of the train's engine, but that was it. No conversations, no music playing from someone's headphones, nothing. It felt wrong. I found an empty seat by the window and sat down, watching the dark landscape rush by. The lights outside flickered occasionally as the train sped through tunnels and empty stretches of land. My eyes started to feel heavy, but I fought to stay awake. That's when I noticed her. A woman, sitting a few rows ahead of me. I hadn't seen her when I boarded, but there she was, staring straight ahead, not moving. She wore a long, dark coat, her black hair falling over her face. Something about her felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I glanced around. The other passengers were still there, but they didn't seem to notice her. I shifted in my seat, feeling uneasy. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing at her, expecting her to move, to get off at the next stop. But she didn't. She just sat there, still and silent. The train passed through a long tunnel, and for a moment, the lights inside the carriage flickered. When they came back on, she was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned forward, trying to see where she had gone, but there was no sign of her. The seat she had been sitting in was empty. I shook my head. Maybe I was just tired, seeing things that weren't there. I tried to relax, but something kept nagging at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A few minutes later, I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone moving slowly down the aisle. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare turn around. The sound got closer and closer until it stopped right behind me. I could feel a presence there, standing just inches away from my seat. Slowly, I turned my head, just enough to see out of the corner of my eye. She was standing there, the woman in the dark coat, her face now fully visible. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes. They were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow all the light around her. I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. She leaned in closer, her cold breath brushing against my neck. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice barely audible but dripping with malice. I bolted out of my seat, stumbling down the aisle, desperate to get away. The other passengers still didn't move, didn't react. It was like they were frozen, trapped in some kind of trance. I ran to the next carriage, heart pounding in my chest. When I reached it, I slammed the door shut behind me, panting for breath. I glanced back through the window, but she was gone. The aisle was empty again. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was losing my mind. I just wanted to get home, but the train seemed endless, its destination further away with every second. Then, I noticed something strange. The other passengers, they weren't moving. They were still sitting in their seats, but their eyes were open, wide, and lifeless. I walked closer, hesitantly reaching out to touch one of them. Cold. They were cold, like statues. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was happening? Where was I? The lights flickered again, and I heard the shuffling sound once more, coming from behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know she was there. I ran as fast as I could, through carriage after carriage, but it didn't matter. The train felt like it went on forever. The same empty seats, the same flickering lights, the same cold, dead passengers. Finally, I reached the end of the train. There was nowhere left to go. I turned to face her. She stood there, her hollow eyes locked on mine, her mouth twisting into a cruel smile. "You can't leave," she whispered. "You're one of us now." The lights went out completely, plunging the train into darkness. I screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember is her cold hands wrapping around my neck, pulling me into the shadows. When I woke up, the train had stopped. The doors were open, and sunlight streamed in. I stumbled out, my legs weak, my mind numb. The platform was empty. No one was there to greet me, no one to tell me what had happened. I looked back at the train, but it was gone, vanished without a trace. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But every night since, I've heard the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance, and I know, deep down, that one day, the last train will come for me again. It was late, and I was tired. I had missed the earlier train and was stuck waiting for the last one. The station was quiet, almost too quiet, with only a few people scattered around, waiting like me. The air was cold, and the lights flickered slightly as if they were struggling to stay on. Finally, the train arrived. Its old rusty exterior gave me an uneasy feeling, but I had no choice. I just wanted to get home. I stepped inside, and to my surprise, the train was almost empty. Only a handful of passengers sat silently, staring straight ahead, their faces expressionless. I found a seat near the middle of the carriage and sat down, trying to get comfortable for the ride. As the train began to move, I noticed something strange. The carriage felt colder than it should have, and the windows were fogged up, even though it wasn't raining outside. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, it was late, and I was exhausted. But as the train rolled through the night, something started to feel very wrong. I glanced around at the other passengers. None of them had moved. They just sat there, stiff, like mannequins. I stared at one man in particular, sitting a few rows ahead of me. His head was tilted slightly to the side, and his eyes were wide open, but he didn't blink. He didn't even seem to be breathing. I tried to convince myself that he was just asleep with his eyes open, but deep down, I knew something was off. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. When the lights came back on, I noticed something that made my heart race. The man I had been watching was now looking straight at me. His head hadn't moved, but his eyes had. They were locked on mine, unblinking. I quickly looked away, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the stress of the day was getting to me. But when I glanced back, his eyes were still fixed on me, and a chill ran down my spine. The train sped through the night, passing through dark tunnels and empty stations. I kept my eyes on the floor, too scared to look up again. I just wanted the ride to end, to get off this creepy train and never think about it again. But then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft whisper right behind me. "Don't turn around." I froze. My body was trembling, but I couldn't move. The whisper was low and raspy, like it came from someone who hadn't spoken in years. I gripped the edge of my seat, trying to stay calm. I didn't want to turn around, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. Slowly, I twisted in my seat and looked over my shoulder. There was no one there. The seat behind me was empty. My heart pounded in my chest. I sat back down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was a trick of the mind. Maybe I was hearing things. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Then, the train screeched to a halt. The lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on right away. The carriage was plunged into darkness, and I could hear the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from the other end of the train. Panic set in. I didn't know what to do. The footsteps were getting closer, louder. I could hear them approaching, but I couldn't see anything. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and the carriage was empty. All the passengers were gone. My heart raced as I stood up, looking around in confusion. Where had everyone gone? There was no way they could have all disappeared in the few seconds the lights were off. The train started moving again, but this time, the windows were pitch black. I couldn't see anything outside, not even the usual blur of trees or buildings. It was like the train was speeding through an endless void. I walked down the aisle, looking for anyone, someone, but the whole train was empty. I was completely alone. Or so I thought. As I reached the end of the carriage, I heard it again, the whisper, "Don't turn around." This time, it was louder, more insistent. My heart was pounding in my ears, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned around. There, standing in the middle of the aisle, was a figure. It was tall and thin, dressed in a tattered, black cloak. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing. I took a step back, but my legs felt heavy, like they were frozen in place. The figure slowly raised its hand, pointing directly at me. "You don't belong here," it hissed. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure started to glide towards me, its cloak billowing as if caught in a strong wind, though the air was still. I backed up against the door at the end of the carriage, frantically trying to open it. My fingers fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was getting closer, its presence filling the air with a suffocating chill. Just as it was about to reach me, the train screeched to a stop, and the doors behind me slid open. I fell out onto the platform, gasping for air. When I looked back, the train was gone. I never saw it leave. It just vanished. Shaken, I stood up and looked around. The platform was completely empty, and there were no signs of the train, no sound of its departure. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know where that train went or who or what was on it. But ever since, I've avoided late-night trains. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of that train's whistle, far in the distance, as if it's calling for me to come back. It was a cold, rainy night, and I was running late. The streets were empty, and the wind howled as I hurried to the station. I had missed the last bus and had no choice but to take the late-night train. When I arrived, the station was almost deserted. Only a few people were sitting on the benches, their faces hidden in the shadows. I checked the schedule. The last train would be here soon. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and waited. The rain drummed against the roof of the station, and the lights flickered slightly. It felt eerie, but I told myself it was just the weather. After a few minutes, I heard the distant sound of a train approaching. Its whistle echoed through the empty station, and soon, the old rusty train came into view. I hesitated for a moment. The train looked ancient, much older than the ones I usually saw. But I had to get home, so I stepped inside. The carriage was almost empty. Only a few passengers sat scattered throughout the rows, their heads down, as if they were asleep. The air inside was cold, colder than it had been outside, and there was a faint smell of something musty, like old forgotten things. I found a seat near the middle and sat down. The train started moving, and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks filled the silence. I stared out the window, but all I could see was darkness and rain. The lights inside the train flickered every now and then, casting long shadows across the empty seats. I tried to relax, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air felt heavy, like I was being watched. I glanced around the carriage. The passengers hadn't moved. They sat perfectly still, not even shifting in their seats. It was as if they were frozen. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just tired. But then, I noticed something strange. One of the passengers, a man sitting a few rows ahead, was wearing clothes that looked old. His jacket was torn, and his shoes were caked in mud. I could only see the back of his head, but something about him didn't seem right. The train passed through a tunnel, and for a moment the lights flickered again. When they came back on, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The man was gone. His seat was empty, and there was no sign of him anywhere in the carriage. I stared at the empty seat, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't heard him get up. I hadn't seen him leave. He had just vanished. I looked around, but the other passengers were still there, sitting in silence. My hands were trembling, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I hadn't seen him properly. Maybe he had quietly moved to another part of the train. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The train sped through the night, and the rain continued to beat against the windows. The air in the carriage grew colder, and the lights began to flicker more frequently. Each time they went out, I held my breath, praying they would come back on. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, coming from the end of the carriage. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sent a chill down my spine. I turned around, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, like someone was standing right behind me, whispering into my ear. "Leave, now." My heart raced, and I jumped out of my seat, stumbling down the aisle. I had to get out of there. I rushed to the door between carriages, but it wouldn't open. I pulled harder, panic setting in, but it was locked. The whispering grew louder, echoing through the empty train. I looked back down the aisle and froze. There, at the far end of the carriage, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, dressed in old, tattered clothes. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. The figure started to move towards me, slowly, as if it had all the time in the world. I backed away, my hands shaking, but there was nowhere to go. The door was locked, and the figure was getting closer. I banged on the door, screaming for help, but no one answered. The other passengers didn't move. They just sat there, staring straight ahead, their faces blank, as if they didn't hear or see what was happening. The figure was almost upon me now. I could feel the cold air around it, could hear the soft, raspy breaths it took as it moved closer. And then, just as it reached me, the lights flickered off completely. Everything went dark. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, and I screamed, stumbling backwards. The train screeched to a stop, and the doors finally slid open behind me. I didn't waste a second. I bolted out of the carriage, running into the rain-soaked platform. When I turned around, the train was gone. There was no sign of it. The platform was empty, and the rain fell silently in the night. I stood there, soaked to the bone, trying to catch my breath. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't understand what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never take the last train again.